Broderick Voss was not a villain. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about him. He was something far more common, and in many ways far more dangerous. He was a coward wearing the face of a reasonable man. He stood beneath that fig tree in his good coat, the one he saved for meetings that mattered, and he did not meet the other man's eyes when he spoke. He looked at the ground. He looked at his hands. He looked at the money being counted into his palm, with the focused desperation of a man who has already made his decision and only needs someone else to make it final. Ilara stood 3 steps behind him. She always stood 3 steps behind someone in those days. Never quite included, never quite dismissed. Her hands were folded in front of her, arms still and quiet the way hands learn to be when they have spent years not reaching for things. She wore a plain gray dress that had been washed so many times the color had given up trying. Her dark hair was pinned back simply. She had not been told to look presentable for this meeting, but she had made herself so anyway, out of a habit older than memory. The habit of trying, even when no one was watching. She was watching, though. She was always watching. The other man spoke in a low voice. She could not hear his words from where she stood, only the cadence of them, measured and unhurried, like a man who had never once been made to rush. He was dressed simply for someone of obvious means. No excessive jewelry, no loud colors. Just well-cut cloth and the particular stillness of a person who does not need to perform authority because they simply have it. His face was turned slightly away from her. She could see the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. The way he stood as though the ground beneath his feet was entirely his. She did not know who he was. She knew only what her father had told her that morning, in the voice he used when he could not bear to be questioned, that there was a man who needed capable help for his household, and that she would be going, and that it was a good arrangement, and that she should be grateful. She had asked no further questions. She had learned long ago that her questions were received in that house, the way all inconvenient things were received, with irritation, with silence, or with the particular cruelty of people who mistake smallness for strength. So she stood beneath the fig tree in the bruising evening light, 3 steps behind her father, and she looked lost. Not the kind of lost that comes from not knowing where you are. The deeper kind, the kind that settles into a person when they have spent so long being told they are nothing that they have begun, against their will, to believe it. She looked like a woman standing at the edge of a life she had not chosen, about to step into a story she had not been asked to enter. What she did not know, what none of them beneath that old fig tree could have known, was that the ground was already shifting, that the man her father was bargaining with was not what her father believed him to be, that the transaction being completed in whispers, in the half-dark, with the figs hanging heavy and still above their heads, was not the end of anything. It was, though it would take time to understand this, the very beginning. Her name was Ilara Voss. She had been called useless. She had been called worthless. She had been overlooked and handed off and reduced, again and again, to whatever was most convenient for the people around her. She had buried her grief for a mother she barely remembered, survived a stepmother who had made an art of quiet cruelty, and endured a father who loved her in theory and failed her in practice, which is, perhaps, the loneliest kind of love there is. She was 20 years old. She had never once been chosen, not for her own sake, not simply because someone looked at her and saw something worth having. That was about to change. The money finished changing hands. Her father turned. He looked at her for a moment, just a moment, and in his eyes there was something that wanted to be an apology, but had not yet found the courage to become one. Then he looked away. The other man finally turned to look at her fully, and for the first time across the distance and the fading light and the low-hanging branches of the ancient fig tree, their eyes met. He looked at her the way no one had looked at her in a very long time, Not through her, not past her, not at the version of her that was useful or convenient or easy to dismiss. He looked at her as though he was genuinely trying to see, and what he saw made him go very still. She lifted her chin, just slightly. It was the smallest act of courage. It was also, though she did not know it yet, the moment everything changed.
She came into the kitchen with her good shawl on, the burgundy one she wore when she wanted to feel in command, and she set a piece of paper on the table with the deliberate calm of someone laying down a card they are very certain will win. The paper had a name on it. And an address. And a sum, a number large enough to cover the debt to Lord Harwick with enough left over for Celine's season in the city, the new dresses, the introduction to society that Marta had been engineering for 3 years and was not, under any circumstances, prepared to sacrifice. The name belonged to a merchant. That was all Broderick was told. A merchant of considerable means who had made his wealth through trade and property and a series of investments that had proven, year after year, to be quietly, almost unnervingly correct. He was known in certain circles, the circles where money moved before anyone else had the chance to follow it, but he kept a low profile in the city itself. He did not attend social gatherings. He did not seek attention. And he had made, through a discreet intermediary, an inquiry. He was looking for a young woman. Specifically, a young woman of good character, modest expectation, and capable disposition, to join his household in an arrangement that was neither marriage nor ordinary service but something that Marta, in her careful retelling of it, chose not to name too precisely. Broderick Voss heard all of this. He sat at the kitchen table in yesterday's shirt, his reading spectacles still on though he had been reading nothing, and he heard every word his wife said. When she finished, the kitchen was so quiet that they could hear the clock in the parlor, each tick a small and patient reminder that time was not stopping for anyone's discomfort. He said, very quietly, "She is my daughter." Marta said, just as quietly, "Then act like it." There was a long silence after that. The kind of silence that is not empty, that is, in fact, full to the edges with everything two people have never quite said to each other and will never quite say. Broderick took off his spectacles and set them on the table. He looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had once had plans. A younger man, in a different kitchen, had sat at a different table and looked at those same hands and believed they were capable of building something that would last. He had been wrong. And the worst thing. The thing that sat in his chest like a stone that would not warm. Was that he had known it for a long time and had kept telling himself otherwise. Celine heard everything from the doorway. She had come downstairs for more sugar in her tea and had stopped in the hall when she heard her mother's voice carrying that particular tone, low, deliberate, the voice she used when she was closing a deal, and she had stayed. Celine had many flaws, most of them inherited and some of them cultivated, but she was not stupid. She understood very quickly what was being proposed. She understood who it concerned. She stood in the hallway with her tea going cold in her hand, and for a moment, a brief, uncomfortable moment that she would spend a great deal of energy forgetting in the days that followed, she felt something that might have been shame. She and Alara had never been close. They had never been enemies either, not really, not in the way that requires genuine feeling. Celine had simply grown up in a house where Alara was positioned below her in every possible sense, and she had accepted that positioning the way a person accepts furniture, without questioning why it was arranged that way, only moving around it as needed. It had never occurred to her to wonder what it felt like to be the furniture. It occurred to her now. Briefly. Then her mother said the number, the sum that would cover the season, the dresses, the introduction, and the moment passed. Celine went back upstairs. She added her own sugar to her own tea. She sat at her dressing table and looked at herself in the mirror for a very long time without expression. She did not go downstairs again until it was over. Broderick found Alara in the garden in the late afternoon, pulling weeds from between the stones of the path the way she always did when she needed something to occupy her hands. The garden had been her mother's. Vivian had planted the roses along the south wall, they were still there, older and wilder now, unpruned and a little unruly, but stubbornly alive in the way that things planted with love tend to be. Elara had kept them going. Not because anyone asked her to. Because they were her mother's, and her mother was not here to ask. Broderick sat on the low stone wall at the garden's edge. He watched her work for a moment before he spoke. He was trying to find the right beginning. There is no right beginning for the thing he had to say, but he did not know that yet. He still believed that the correct arrangement of words might make it hurt less. This is a thing that people tell themselves when they are about to do something they cannot defend. They spend so long on the delivery that they convince themselves the delivery is the point. He told her there was an opportunity. He said the word carefully, like a man setting down something fragile. He told her there was a merchant, a good man, a man of means, who needed capable help in his household, and that it was a fine position, better than most, and that she would be looked after. He said looked after in the same tone people use when they are describing what will happen to a thing they are giving away, not a person who makes choices, but an object transferred from one set of hands to another. Elara stopped pulling weeds. She sat back on her heels and looked at her father. She looked at him the way she had been looking at him for years, with the careful, measuring patience of a woman who had spent her whole life trying to find something in his face that was equal to what she needed from him. Some fathers offer safety just by existing. Some fathers make a child feel that the world is manageable because he is in it. Broderick Voss had not been that father. He had been present in the body and absent in every way that mattered, and Elara had known this since she was old enough to understand the difference, which was earlier than any child should have to. She asked him one question. She did not ask about the merchant, or the household, or the position. She asked, how much? He did not answer. His silence was its own answer. It told her the number was not in her favor, because if it had been, if this had been anything other than a transaction, he would have spoken without hesitation. Instead he looked at the garden wall. He looked at the roses. He looked at everything except his daughter's face. Elara stood up. She brushed the dirt from her hands slowly and completely, the way she did everything, thoroughly, without rushing, as though the task deserved her full attention even now. Even here. She had always been this way. It was the thing about her that nobody in this house had ever understood. She gave her full attention to everything, even the things that were being done to her. She said nothing for a very long time. The sun was low behind the rooftops. The roses cast long shadows across the path. Somewhere nearby a bird was making the particular sound that birds make just before evening, that last, insistent call, as if reminding the light that it is still here, still watching, still singing, even as the dark comes in. Then she said, "All right, Father." Just that. All right. 2 syllables that contained a world of things she chose not to say. Not because she did not have the words. Elara always had the words. She had simply learned, over 20 years in this house, that some words are wasted on people who have already made their decisions, that spending them is like pouring water into a broken vessel and calling it kindness. Broderick looked at her then. Finally. And what crossed his face in that moment, what moved through his eyes in the half-second before he looked away again, was not relief. It was not even guilt, exactly. It was something smaller and sadder than guilt. It was the expression of a man who had just understood, fully and completely, what he was losing, and had discovered, too late, that he did not have the courage to stop it. That night, Elara packed a bag. It was a small bag, the only one she owned, worn brown leather with a brass clasp that no longer closed all the way, and she filled it with the things that were actually hers. Not the things she used. Not the dishes she washed or the linens she pressed or the floors she kept clean. The things that belonged to her in the way that mattered, her mother's blue shawl, soft from years of careful keeping. A small book of pressed flowers that Vivian had started and Elara had continued. A single letter, sealed and never opened, that had arrived for her on her 16th birthday with her mother's name in the return address and no explanation. She had never been able to open it and had never been able to throw it away. A hair comb with a crack down the middle that she'd kept not because it was beautiful but because it had been on her mother's dressing table the morning she died, and some objects carry weight that has nothing to do with their size. She sat on the edge of her bed when the bag was packed and looked at the wall where the faded portrait hung, her mother's face, young and warm and slightly blurred by time and distance, the way memory eventually blurs everything it most wants to keep. She had talked to that portrait more times than she would ever admit. In the worst years, when the cruelty in the house was quiet and relentless and the kind that leaves no mark because it never touches the skin, she had sat exactly here, exactly like this, and told her mother about her day. About the small indignities. About the moments she had held herself together by her fingernails. About the things she wished someone alive would say to her. She did not do that tonight. Tonight she simply looked at the portrait and breathed, in and out, slowly, the way her mother had taught her to breathe when the world felt like too much. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. Let the feeling move through you like weather, don't fight it, don't chase it, just let it pass. It did not fully pass. But it moved enough. She had one thought, very clear, before she lay down and closed her eyes. She did not know where she was going. She did not know who was waiting for her on the other side of tomorrow. She did not know what kind of house she would be delivered to, or what kind of life would be expected of her once she arrived. She knew nothing except this: she had survived this house. She had survived 14 years without her mother and 20 years without being truly seen, and she had not broken. She had been bent, certainly. She had been worn thin in places that still hurt when the weather changed. But she had not broken. And whatever came next, she would survive it too. She was certain of this the way she was certain of very few things, not with hope, which is fragile, but with something older and harder, something that had been forged in her by every difficult morning she had ever gotten through. She was her mother's daughter. She would not break. Thursday came the way Thursdays always come, without ceremony, without warning, with a light that is neither dramatic nor kind, only functional. The kind of morning light that simply is. Elara was dressed and downstairs before anyone else stirred. She had made tea. She had set the table. Old habit. The last meal she would prepare in this kitchen, and she made it the same way she had made every other, carefully, completely, without cutting corners, as if the task itself deserved the full measure of her attention regardless of what it meant or didn't mean. Marta came down first. She was dressed well, better than the occasion required, and she said good morning in the voice she used when she had already won something and was being gracious about it. She poured her tea. She did not look at Elara directly, the way certain people cannot look directly at the thing they've arranged to have removed. Celine came down next. She sat across the table from Elara and for a moment she looked like she might say something. Her mouth opened slightly. There was something in her eyes, something unguarded and young that very rarely made it to the surface, and Elara waited, genuinely curious, to hear what it was. Then Celine looked at her plate. She picked up her fork. The moment closed like a door, gently but completely, and whatever was behind it stayed behind it. Broderick did not come down at all. The carriage arrived at 8:30. It was finer than Elara had expected, not extravagant, but well kept, pulled by two dark horses with the steady, untroubled gait of animals that had never been asked to hurry. The coachman who handled her bag did so without comment, without condescension, and without the slightly apologetic wince that people sometimes directed at her, as though they were embarrassed on her behalf. He simply took the bag and placed it with care, and something about that small, impersonal courtesy was unexpectedly steadying. She stood at the gate for a moment before she got in. The house behind her was the only home she had ever known. She had been born in the upstairs room with the green wallpaper. She had learned to walk in the garden, among her mother's roses. She had cooked her first meal in that kitchen, at the age of 7, because she had watched her mother do it so many times and wanted to try, and when the broth came out wrong her mother had laughed, not unkindly, but the full-body laugh of a woman genuinely delighted by the attempt, and helped her start again. She had lived and grieved and endured inside those walls. And she was leaving them now without being asked if she was ready, without being told where she was going, without a single person inside that house coming to the gate to watch her go. She looked at the house for one long moment. Then she picked up the hem of her plain gray dress, stepped into the carriage, and sat down. The door closed. The horses moved. The house slid past the window and then it was gone, replaced by the narrow street, and then the wider road, and then the morning sky opening above the rooftops, pale and enormous and belonging to no one. She kept her hands folded in her lap. Her back straight. Her face composed. If she was afraid, and she was, in the deep, quiet, unspectacular way that brave people are afraid, she gave it no ground. She breathed in through the nose. Out through the mouth. She watched the city moving past the window, the market stalls setting up for the morning, a child chasing a dog through a lane, a woman hanging washing between two buildings, all of it so ordinary and so entirely indifferent to the carriage passing through, to the girl inside it, to the life being rearranged one cobblestone at a time. She noticed, after a while, that they had passed through the merchant quarter without stopping. She noticed the roads getting quieter, the buildings becoming larger, the trees lining the lane growing older and more deliberate, the way trees do when they have been planted with intention rather than allowed to simply happen. She noticed that the carriage had been traveling for longer than she expected, and in a direction that did not align with anything she had been told. She sat up slightly. She looked out the window more closely. She was doing the thing she always did, measuring, quietly, what she actually knew against what she had been allowed to know, and noticing, with the practiced calm of a woman accustomed to discovering that the truth is different from what she was given, that the distance between those two things was, once again, considerable. It was not a merchant's house she was going to. She understood this, incrementally, as the lane widened and the gates appeared ahead, iron, tall, set into stone pillars carved with a crest she did not recognize. Beyond them, at the end of a long avenue of oaks, a manor house. Not large. Immense. The kind of building that does not announce itself because it does not need to, that simply exists in the landscape with the quiet, absolute confidence of something that has been there long enough to believe it always will be. She looked at the crest on the gate as the carriage slowed. She did not recognize the design, she had not been educated in crests, had not been educated in much beyond what she had taught herself, but she recognized the implication of it. The weight of it. The way it sat on those stone pillars like something that expected to be understood. A cold, clear, entirely calm thought moved through her then, quiet as a blade between ribs. Her father had not sent her to a merchant. Her father did not know where he had sent her at all. The carriage passed through the gates of Ashenfall. The avenue of oaks closed overhead like a cathedral ceiling. And Ilara Voss, who had been called useless, and worthless, and too much and not enough and everything in between, sat up a little straighter in her seat, folded her hands a little more deliberately in her lap, and decided that whatever she was walking into, she would walk into it with her eyes open. She had not been given a choice in coming here. But she was very much going to choose how she arrived.
Chapter 1. The Voss house had a smell. Every house has one. The particular scent that soaks into the walls over years and becomes the house itself, inseparable from the wood and the plaster, and the memory of everyone who has ever lived inside it. The Voss house smelled of stale tobacco, of cabbage cooked too long, and underneath everything, very faintly, of lavender. The ghost of a woman who had been dead 14 years and whose presence, despite every effort by the woman who replaced her, refused to entirely leave. Ilara noticed it every morning when she came downstairs. The lavender. She had never told anyone about it. It felt like something that belonged only to her. One small inheritance her mother had managed to leave behind. It was a Wednesday when everything fell apart. Wednesdays were laundry days, which meant Ilara had been awake since before the sun, hauling water, feeding the fire beneath the wash basin, working her hands raw on linen that did not belong to her. She had finished Celine's blouses, her stepmother's good tablecloth, her father's collar shirts, pressing each one with the kind of careful precision that no one had ever once acknowledged, when she heard the first voice come through the parlor door. Not a family voice, a stranger's voice, clipped, official, carrying the particular coldness of a man delivering news he has delivered many times before and has long since stopped feeling anything about. She did not press her ear to the door. She did not have to. The walls of the Voss house were thin in the way that struggling houses always are, as if even the architecture had given up pretending everything was fine. The man was a debt collector. His name, she would later learn, was Aldrich Peen, and he worked for Lord Harwick, a name spoken in their household the way certain names are spoken in certain households, in low tones, with a particular tension in the jaw, as if the name itself could do damage. Lord Harwick had extended credit to Broderick Voss 18 months ago, then again 6 months after that, and again, and again. The extensions had been generous in the way that traps are generous, offering exactly enough room to step inside before the jaws close. The debt was now, in the language of Aldrich Peen, terminal. By the end of the season, the Voss family would lose the house, the furniture, whatever remained of value. Broderick Voss had nothing left to offer and nowhere left to turn. And the collector said all of this in a voice so flat and so final that it was almost worse than if he had shouted it. Shouting, at least, contains emotion. This contained none. It was simply arithmetic. Ilara stood in the corridor, holding a pressed collar shirt, and listened to the sound of her father's world folding in on itself. She had known something was wrong for months, the kind of knowing that lives in the body before the mind is ready to admit it. The way she'd noticed him stopping at the bottom of the staircase some mornings, just standing there, looking at nothing, before he gathered himself and moved on. The letters he burned rather than left on the desk. The way food had quietly become simpler, then simpler again, and no one in the house mentioned it because to mention it would be to make it real. The front door closed. Our Aldrich Peen was gone, taking with him all pretense that the situation was manageable. Ilara slipped the collar shirt onto its hanger, hung it on the hook by the stairs, and went back to the kitchen. She put the kettle on. She did not know what else to do, and making tea was something. It was small, and it was ordinary, and it required her hands to move. And right then she needed her hands to move. Martha Voss came to her own conclusions the way she did everything else, quickly, efficiently, and without the burden of sentiment. By nightfall, she had already formed a plan. By the following morning, she had refined it. She waited until Celine was at her dressing table and Ilara was setting the breakfast table before she brought it up, because Marta understood. With the precision of a woman who had spent 20 years navigating a household on the edge of ruin, that the placement of an audience mattered enormously when delivering news that someone was not going to like.
Chapter 2. The gates of Ashenfall did not creak. That was the first thing Ilara noticed. Every gate she had ever passed through in her life had announced itself, iron complaining against iron, rust and age making a sound like something reluctant to open. These gates swung wide in silence. Heavy and certain and completely without protest, the way things move when they are maintained by people who take maintenance seriously. It was such a small detail. But Ilara had spent 20 years reading small details, because small details were almost always the truest thing about a place, and this one told her something immediately: whoever owned this estate did not tolerate neglect. Not of gates. Not of anything. The avenue of oaks continued for a full minute after the gates, long enough that she began to understand the scale of what she was entering. These were not decorative trees. They were old, thick-trunked, planted in 2 straight lines with a precision that suggested they had been placed there not to impress visitors but simply because someone had decided, a very long time ago, that this was where they belonged. She counted them without meaning to. It was the kind of thing her mind did when her body was nervous, found something orderly to hold on to. 14 oaks on each side. 28 in total. All of them still. All of them watching. And then the manor appeared at the end of the avenue, and she stopped counting. It was not the size of it that took her breath, though it was enormous. It was not the architecture, though the stone was dark and fine and every window was perfectly proportioned. It was the way it sat in the landscape, settled, rooted, entirely at ease with itself, as though it had not been built so much as grown. As though it had simply decided, at some point in the distant past, that this particular hill in this particular valley was where it would be, and the hill and valley had agreed without argument. Elara had seen grand buildings before, in the way that people who pass through cities see things, briefly, from the outside, without invitation. She had never before felt that a building was looking back. Lieutenant Fenwick met her at the carriage door. He was a lean man of middling height with a face that gave very little away and eyes that missed absolutely nothing, the kind of eyes that belong to people who have spent a long time in service to someone powerful and have learned that observation is the most useful skill they possess. He introduced himself briefly, confirmed her name with the efficient courtesy of a man working from a list, and informed her she was expected. She was expected. That detail landed strangely. In the Voss house, she had spent 20 years being the last person anyone expected, her presence always incidental, her absence rarely noticed. To be expected, even in the administrative sense, even as cargo delivered on a schedule, was an unfamiliar sensation. She filed it away. Dame Rosalind was waiting at the top of the steps, and the moment Elara saw her she understood that this was the woman who actually ran Ashenfall. Not in the legal sense. Not on paper. But in every sense that mattered, in the arrangement of the household, in the mood of the corridors, in the particular quality of quiet that settled over a well-managed house like clean linen, smooth and without wrinkle. Rosalind had the bearing of someone who had seen a great many things and been alarmed by very few of them. She looked at Elara the way a watchmaker looks at an unfamiliar mechanism, not unkindly, but with the careful attention of someone determining, before anything else, whether the parts are sound. Whatever she found in that assessment, she kept to herself. She simply said, "Follow me." And Elara followed, because Dame Rosalind was the sort of woman who made following feel like the obvious and correct choice, as natural as gravity. The inside of Ashenfall Manor was quieter than she expected. She had braced herself for grandeur in the loud sense, gold leaf, excessive portraiture, the architectural equivalent of someone clearing their throat to be noticed. There was none of that. The entrance hall was large and high-ceilinged, yes, and the dark wood paneling was polished to a shine that reflected the morning light in long, clean streaks, and the chandelier above was not small, but none of it performed. It simply existed, with the same settled confidence as the building itself, as though beauty here was not an achievement to be displayed but a condition to be maintained. She noticed the floors. Flawless. She noticed the flowers on the hall table, fresh, arranged without excess, replaced recently enough that not a single petal had fallen. She noticed that every surface she passed was clean in the specific way that only comes from consistent, disciplined care. Someone in this house paid attention. Someone in this house believed that the unseen work was worth doing well. She understood that feeling completely. The study was at the end of a corridor lined with books, not decorative books, arranged by height and color for effect, but working books, shelved without vanity, some of them marked with slips of paper, some of them clearly read more than once. The door was open. Dame Rosalind paused outside it, straightened almost imperceptibly, knocked once, and entered. Elara followed her in, and then she stopped. He was standing at the window with his back to them. Not because he had not heard them enter, a man like this always heard, but because he was finishing a thought, completing a sentence in whatever document was spread across the desk to his right, and he did not see fit to abandon it mid-sentence simply because someone had arrived. She understood this immediately, and what surprised her was that she did not find it rude. In the Voss house, being made to wait was a power game, a small cruelty dressed as distraction. This felt different. This felt like a man who simply finished what he started. He was tall. Dark-haired. The kind of man who occupied physical space without appearing to try, who stood as though the floor beneath him was specifically designed for exactly that purpose and he had simply obliged it. He wore no excess. No decorative chain, no jeweled ring, no embellishment that might suggest he needed reminding of his own importance. Just well-cut cloth in dark colors, and the straight-backed stillness of a person who had spent so long in command that authority had stopped being something he did and become something he simply was. He set down his pen. And then he turned. She had been preparing herself for this moment since the carriage passed through the gates, assembling her expression, steadying her breathing, deciding in advance that whoever this man was, she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. What she had not prepared for was the quality of his attention when he looked at her. Most people who held power looked at people below them in one of two ways: through them, as though they were furniture to be acknowledged and forgotten, or down at them, with the particular tilt of the chin that says I have already decided what you are. This man looked at her as though he was genuinely interested in what he was seeing. Not warmly, there was nothing warm about it, not yet, but with a precise, unblinking attention that landed on her like a hand placed flat on a table. Present. Deliberate. Considering. It was, she realized with a start, the first time in a very long time that she had felt genuinely looked at. Not examined for faults. Not surveyed for usefulness. Simply seen. She did not let any of that show on her face. He said her name. Miss Voss. He said it the way he apparently said most things, quietly, without decorating it, as though the words were tools and he had learned not to waste them. She answered with his title, and then, because she had spent the entire journey from the Voss house to these gates swallowing things she needed to say, and this was the first moment she had been in a room with someone capable of answering for them, she said what she actually meant. She told him that her father had described him as a merchant. She said it plainly, without accusation, the way you state a fact before requesting its correction. She watched his face. There was no flicker of surprise, no embarrassment, not even the small political scramble of a man caught in a convenient untruth. He simply acknowledged it. Yes, he conducted considerable commerce, the description was not entirely inaccurate, with the composure of a man who had known the full picture all along and had made his peace with the fact that others hadn't. That composure told her something important. He had known that her father didn't know who he was. He had chosen not to correct it. She turned that over carefully in her mind, the way she turned all things that required understanding, slowly, without rushing to a conclusion, looking at every side before deciding what it meant. He told her the arrangement. Simply, directly, without softening it into something it wasn't. She would join the household under Dame Rosalind's direction. The debt to Lord Harwick would be cleared in full. The terms were fixed. Did she find that objectionable? She looked at him for a long moment before she answered. Not because she didn't know what she wanted to say. She knew exactly what she wanted to say. She was simply deciding whether this was the kind of room in which she was allowed to say it, whether this man, for all his stillness and his titles and the weight of the house behind him, was someone who would hear it or someone who would punish it. She decided to find out. She asked him whether the transaction troubled him at all. She said it calmly, not to wound, not to perform bravery, but because she genuinely needed the answer. She was going to live in this house. She needed to know what kind of man she was living under. And she had learned, through long experience, that the questions people find most uncomfortable to answer are almost always the ones most worth asking. The study went very quiet. Dame Rosalind, to her considerable credit, did not move a muscle. Fenwick, somewhere behind her, appeared to be studying the ceiling with intense interest. And Caspian Ashford, Duke of Ashenfall, the man who did not raise his voice because he never had to, the man who finished his sentences before acknowledging arrivals, the man who had just legally received a woman in exchange for the clearance of a family debt, looked at Alara Voss with something new in his expression. Not offense. Not cold authority reasserting itself. Something that took her a moment to name, because she had not expected to find it here, in this room, on this man's face. It was respect. Quiet, reluctant, and entirely genuine. He told her she could speak her mind in Ashenfall. He said he preferred it. And the way he said it, not as a concession, not as an indulgence granted by the powerful to the powerless, but as a simple statement of fact, the way a man tells you that the kitchen is down the hall and the library is on the second floor, told her that he meant it. She was escorted out. The door to the study closed behind her. She stood for one moment in the corridor of books and breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth, and noticed something that hadn't happened to her in a very long time. She was not afraid. She was uncertain, yes. She was surrounded by the unknown. She was standing in a house that was not hers, in a life that had been arranged without her permission, dependent on the goodwill of a man she had known for less than 10 minutes. And she was not afraid. She did not yet know why. She would understand it later, that it was the respect on his face, and the books on the walls, and the clean floors, and the gates that swung without complaint, and the flowers replaced before they could fall. All of it saying, in the wordless language of a well-kept place, someone here pays attention. Someone here believes that things worth having are worth tending. Behind the closed study door, Caspian Ashford picked up his pen. Set it back down. Picked it up again. Fenwick, who had served him for 6 years and knew better than to comment on most things, allowed himself one observation. He said she was remarkable. The Duke told him not to start. Fenwick said he hadn't said anything. The Duke said he was about to say something insufferable about fate, and he would prefer he didn't. Fenwick considered this. Then he said that he had actually been going to say she was going to be interesting. Which was different from fate. Arguably. There was a pause. The pen moved across paper. Outside the window, the oak avenue stood in 2 straight lines, patient and perfectly still. The Duke of Ashenfall said, "Yes. She is." And he did not say anything else. But he did not, for a very long time, return to reading. Chapter 3. The room they gave her was small. She had been told it would be small, and it was, but small in Ashenfall was a different language than small in the Voss house. There was a window that faced east, which meant the morning light arrived first and stayed longest. The bed had a proper frame, a proper mattress, and linen that smelled of cedar and clean air rather than damp and old wool. There was a writing desk, a real one, with a drawer that opened smoothly, and a chair that did not wobble, and a hook on the back of the door for hanging things, positioned at exactly the right height, as though someone had thought about the person who would use it before they put it there. It was the hook that got her. Such a small thing. Such a considered thing. She stood looking at it for longer than she should have, and then she hung up her mother's blue shawl and went to find her place in the household. She found it quickly, because Elara had always had a talent for finding her place. Not the place assigned to her, she had spent 20 years in an assigned place and it had never once fit, but the true place, the functional one, the position in any room or any system where she was most useful and least in the way. In Ashenfall this turned out to be everywhere and nowhere in particular, which suited her exactly. Dame Rosalind ran a tight household. Tight in the way that a good watch is tight, every part doing its job, nothing loose, nothing wasted. Elara stepped into it the way a missing piece steps into a puzzle, with a small, satisfying click that nobody announced but everyone felt. She learned the house the way she learned most things, through observation first, action second, questions only when necessary and precisely worded. She learned which floorboards creaked and which doors needed lifting slightly before they would close. She learned that the cook, a wide and formidable woman named Hetty, accepted help in her kitchen only if it was offered without commentary and executed without error, and that if you met both those conditions, she would set a plate in front of you without being asked, which was Hetty's version of high praise. She learned that Fenwick took his tea at 11 and his lunch at 1 and that he was always somewhere in the vicinity of wherever the Duke was likely to need something, hovering with the practiced invisibility of a man who had elevated helpfulness into an art form. She learned that Lisa, the young maid assigned to show her the linen closets on her second day, laughed at everything and apologized for nothing, and that this quality, so rare, so effortless, was worth more than she could say. What she did not learn, in those first days, was anything at all about Caspian Ashford. Not for lack of observation. She observed him constantly, in the careful peripheral way she observed everything she was not yet certain of, the way you watch a fire, respecting the heat, noting the behavior, never quite turning your back on it. She saw him cross the entrance hall in the mornings, always punctual, always purposeful, with the unhurried speed of a man who had somewhere to be and had long since calculated the exact pace required to get there without rushing. She saw him in the dining room at supper, eating alone with a book open beside his plate, not rudely, not performatively, but with the genuine ease of a man entirely comfortable in his own company. She saw him pause once at the window of the east corridor and look out at the gardens for a long, still moment, and there was something in that pause, something unguarded that had no business being on the face of a man that composed, that she filed away and did not take out again for some time. He did not speak to her. Not in those first days. He acknowledged her when they passed in the corridor, a brief nod, precise and unremarkable, the same acknowledgment he would give any member of the household, and she returned it in kind, and they moved on. It was a perfectly appropriate arrangement. It was also, though she would not have admitted it, the kind of absence that has a shape. The kind you notice not because of what it is but because of what it isn't. It was Lisa who told her things. Not gossip, or not only gossip, but the living texture of a place that no formal introduction can provide. The history that lives in people's faces and habits and the particular way they go quiet when certain subjects arise. Lisa delivered all of it cheerfully, without malice, the way a person shares things they genuinely believe will be useful, pausing occasionally to hold up a bedsheet and determine which end was which. The Duke had been running Ashenfall alone since he was 23, she said. His father had died, suddenly, a riding accident, no warning, and Caspian had inherited not just the title and the estate but a considerable number of debts his father had quietly accumulated and not mentioned to anyone. He had cleared them all within 2 years. Nobody knew quite how, or rather, people had theories, but the theories were all slightly different, which suggested none of them were entirely right. What everyone agreed on was that he had done it without asking for help, without selling land, and without appearing, on the surface, to be doing anything but running the estate exactly as it had always been run. His mother had died 3 years before his father. That was the loss that had really changed him, Lisa said, lowering her voice slightly in the way people do when they speak of things they feel rather than know. The Duchess had been, and here Lisa searched for the word and found it with some care, warm. The kind of warmth that makes a house feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. After she was gone, the house had taken on its current quality, beautiful, immaculate, and profoundly quiet in the way of places that have had their center removed. Elara listened to all of this and said very little. But she thought about it afterward, alone in her east-facing room with the light coming through the window in long evening bars, and she thought about a 23-year-old boy inheriting a weight that would have broken most men and deciding, without announcement, to simply carry it. She thought about a house that had once been warm and had since learned to be something else. She thought about the book on the desk in the study, the poetry collection she had glimpsed, the inscription on the first page that she had seen without meaning to, and she added all of it together with the careful arithmetic of someone building a picture from pieces she was not supposed to have. She did not conclude anything. Not yet. But the picture was beginning to have a shape. The library was on the second floor at the far end of the south wing, and it was the finest room in the house. Not the most impressive, the formal dining room held that title, with its long table and its portraits and its air of occasions that had once happened there and might again. But the library was the finest, in the way that useful, honest things are finer than decorative ones. Floor to ceiling. 3 walls of it. The 4th wall was windows, overlooking the gardens, and in the mornings when the light came in at the right angle the whole room glowed amber and warm, and the smell of old paper and ink and the particular sweetness of books that have been read many times by many hands rose from the shelves like something living. Elara had found it on her 3rd day. She had been returning a volume of household accounts to the wrong shelf. She corrected herself immediately upon realizing, replaced it precisely where it belonged, and in the process of correcting herself she had stopped. And looked. and stood very still in the middle of the library of Ashenfall for approximately 30 seconds, during which she forgot, entirely, the household accounts, Dame Rosalind's morning instructions, and the fact that she was not supposed to be lingering. She had always loved books the way hungry people love food, not casually, not as a leisure, but with the specific, physical gratitude of someone who knows what it is to go without. Her mother had owned 7 books. 7. Ilara had read all of them so many times that she could recite passages without trying, the words worn into her memory the way paths are worn into grass, not by any single crossing, but by the accumulated weight of every return. To stand in this room was to feel something that she had no tidy word for. It was somewhere between grief and joy and the particular ache of being given something you had stopped believing you deserved. She came back to the library whenever she could find the time. Never long, a few minutes here, a quarter-hour there, always with a reason that was technically legitimate, always moving towards something that needed doing even as she let her eyes travel the spines, reading titles, noting what was there, building a private map of the shelves the way a traveler maps a country they intend to return to properly someday. It was on one of these brief, stolen visits that she turned from the shelves and found him standing in the doorway. He did not look surprised. She suspected he was rarely surprised by anything, that his face had simply decided, at some point, that surprise was an expression it could not afford. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the study, directly, without performing the look, without making it into something it didn't need to be. And then he asked the question that nobody in the Voss house had ever thought to ask her. He asked if she read. It was such a simple question. So entirely without agenda. He asked it the way you ask someone if they take sugar in their tea, not rhetorically, not as the setup for a judgment, but because he genuinely wanted to know the answer and had no reason not to ask it directly. She felt the simplicity of it land somewhere unexpected and had to take a half-second to compose herself before she answered. She told him yes. She told him her mother had taught her. She told him, and this was the part she had not planned to say, the part that came out because the library was warm and his question had been genuine and she was, she realized, more starved for honest conversation than she had known, that her mother had told her reading was the one thing no one could ever take from you. He was quiet for a moment after she said that. The kind of quiet that is not absence but consideration, the quiet of someone turning a thing over before responding to it, giving it the attention it deserves. Then he moved to one of the shelves. He found a volume without looking for it, reached directly, unhesitatingly, the way people reach for things they know by heart, and he set it on the reading table near her. Not handed it to her. Set it near her. As if he was offering it without requiring her to accept. She glanced at the cover. Poetry. She looked up at him with an expression she hoped was neutral and suspected was not entirely. She said she hadn't expected that. Poetry. From him. He said, very drilly, that he was not made entirely of ledgers and contracts. And there it was, so small and so sudden that she almost missed it. The corner of his mouth. Not a smile, not quite, not yet, but the shape of one. The outline of it. The suggestion that somewhere beneath the composure and the title and the 6 years of running an estate alone and the quiet he wore like armor, there was a man who was capable of being quietly, drilly, entirely unexpectedly funny. She told him she was beginning to suspect that. She said it before she had decided to say it, which was unusual for her. She was not a woman who said things before deciding to. And then she heard how it sounded, and she felt the ghost of warmth in her own face, and she looked back at the book. He left the room. She opened the book to the first page. And there, in handwriting she recognized from the inscription she had glimpsed once before, a woman's hand, unhurried and warm, were the words, "For Caspian." So you remember that some things cannot be managed. Only felt. Mama. She closed the book gently and held it for a moment, this object that was not hers and had never been hers but felt, in some way she couldn't account for, as though it had been waiting. Then she placed it carefully back on the table, exactly where he had set it, and she went back to work. But she carried the inscription with her for the rest of the day, the way you carry a song you heard once in passing, quietly, almost without noticing, until you realize it has been with you for hours. Dame Rosalind noticed everything. This was her function, her gift, and in 40 years of running households for powerful people, it had never once failed her. She noticed the way Alara moved through Ashenfall, not tentatively, not with the apologetic smallness of someone who has been told repeatedly that they take up too much space, but with a quiet intentionality that was entirely her own. She noticed that the east corridor was always tidier after Alara had passed through it, not because Alara had been asked to tidy it but because her hands simply corrected things as she moved, straightening what was crooked, replacing what had fallen, the way an orderly mind moves through a disordered world. She noticed that the Duke had begun taking a slightly longer route from the study to the dining room at supper. A route that happened to pass the south wing, where the library was. She noticed that on the evening after the library encounter, he had asked Fenwick, with studied casualness, as though it were an administrative inquiry of no particular significance, whether the new household member had found the library adequately stocked for her tastes. Fenwick had relayed this question to Rosalind with an expression of careful innocence that did not fool her for a single moment. In 6 years, the Duke had never once inquired about the reading preferences of any member of his household. She chose not to say any of this to Alara directly. Not yet. She was a woman who understood timing, who knew that some things, pressed too early, collapse under the weight of the attention. But she watched. She kept her own counsel. And on the evening after the library, when Alara came to the staff supper and sat across from her and said nothing about the afternoon, Rosalind poured her tea and remarked, without looking up, that the library was an exceptional room. Alara said she agreed. She said it evenly, without color, with the particular smoothness of someone who has been asked a question they were expecting and had prepared a non-answer for. Rosalind almost smiled. The girl was more guarded than she appeared. That was good. That was, in fact, exactly right. The things worth having in this life required care in the handling, and a woman who had learned to guard herself with that degree of precision had also, by definition, learned the value of what she was guarding. She said nothing else about it. She drank her tea. Alara drank hers. The candles burned low in the staff hall, and outside the windows of Ashenfall, the last of the evening gave up the sky to a dark so clean and deep it looked polished, and the first stars appeared one by one, and the house settled around them both with the slow exhale of an old building finding its rest. It was a small thing, an evening, a cup of tea, a conversation about nothing. But small things in old houses have a way of meaning more than they appear. The roots of everything that matters run deep and begin quietly, and this ordinary evening, this unremarkable supper, was the soil in which something was already, silently, taking hold. Neither of them knew it yet. Or perhaps they did, in the way that bodies know things before minds are willing to, in the extra beat of attention, in the careful smoothness of a non-answer, in the route from the study to the dining room that was 3 minutes longer than it needed to be and taken every evening now, without fail, without acknowledgement, without any explanation at all. Chapter 4. The rain came without warning on a Tuesday evening in late spring, the way the most consequential things tend to come, not announced, not preceded by reasonable signs, but suddenly and all at once, as though the sky had been holding its breath for weeks and had simply decided it was done. One moment the gardens were still and dry and smelling of turned earth and new roses. The next, the windows of Ashenfall were streaming, the gravel paths had become rivers, and the sound of water against stone filled every corridor of the manor with a low, constant roar that was not quite music and not quite noise but something in between, something that pressed in close and made the house feel smaller, and warmer, and more intimate than it had any right to be. Alara had been in the east corridor when it started. She had finished her evening tasks, the linens checked, the candles in the guest rooms trimmed, a loose hinge on the blue room door reported to Fenwick in the matter-of-fact way she reported everything, without dramatizing and without minimizing, and she had a quarter of an hour before supper that belonged, technically, to no one. These small pockets of unclaimed time were still new enough to feel faintly illicit. In the Voss house there had been no such thing as unassigned time. If she was still, she was accused of idleness. If she moved without a clear purpose, she was accused of wandering. The concept of a few minutes that were simply hers, not earned by extra labor, not stolen from sleep, not taken at the risk of someone's disapproval, was one she was still learning to hold without apology. She stood at the tall window at the end of the east corridor and she watched the rain. It was a good window for watching weather. It faced west, which meant she could see the storm moving across the valley, the dark curtain of it sweeping over the hills in the distance, consuming the last of the pale evening light as it came, relentless and unhurried and entirely magnificent. She had always loved storms. Not the domestic variety, not the storms that lived inside houses, that were made of human voices and accumulated grievances and the particular violence of people who had nowhere else to put what they felt. Those she had simply learned to survive. But the outdoor kind. The real kind. Rain was the great leveler. It fell on the Voss house and on Ashenfall Manor with equal indifference, which meant it belonged to neither of them, which meant it was one of the few things in the world that she had always felt, unreservedly, was also hers. She did not hear him approach. She was not sure anyone ever heard Caspian Ashford approach. He moved through his own house with the quiet economy of a man who had never needed to announce himself and had long since stopped doing so out of habit. She became aware of him the way you become aware of a change in temperature, gradually, peripherally, without being able to name the exact moment it happened. And then he was simply there, standing a few feet to her left at the same window, looking out at the same rain, and neither of them said anything for a moment that was longer than courtesy required and neither of them moved to fill it. He spoke first. He noted that she was not afraid of storms. He said it with the particular inflection of a man who has been watching someone for long enough to have formed opinions and has finally found a reason to voice one. Not an accusation. An observation. The kind that invites a response without demanding one. She told him she had grown up in a house where the storms were indoors. She said it simply, without self-pity, without performing the wound, in the same tone she might have used to say that she had grown up in a house with small rooms or low ceilings, as a fact of architecture, not an invitation to sympathy. She was watching the rain as she said it and did not turn to look at him. He was quiet for a moment. She had noticed this about him, that he did not fill silences reflexively, did not reach for the nearest acceptable response just to avoid the discomfort of a pause. He let things land before he answered them. It was, she had decided, one of the most respectful conversational habits a person could have, and also one of the rarest. Then he said something that she had not expected. He told her he had known, when he agreed to the arrangement with her father, that her family had not been kind to her. He said it plainly, not to perform sympathy, not to position himself as her rescuer, but with the directness of a man stating something he believes the other person deserves to hear. He told her that the creditor had mentioned it, almost as an aside, clearly expecting it to diminish her value in his eyes. And that it had not. That it had, in fact, had the opposite effect. She turned to look at him then. She could not help it. He was still watching the rain, profile toward her, jaw set, entirely composed, and there was something in the angle of his face in the storm-gray light that was different from how he looked in daylight. Daylight suited the Duke. It showed him correctly, sharp-edged, formal, the complete and finished architecture of a man in command of himself. But this light, this dim, rain-washed, early evening light, showed something else underneath. Something that the daylight version of him kept very carefully behind the daylight version of himself. Something that had not yet been named between them and perhaps could not be. Not yet. She asked him why. Why it had the opposite effect. She asked because she genuinely needed to know, because the answer would tell her something about the quality of this man that no amount of household observation could tell her, something that lived deeper than governance and efficiency and the silent gates and the working books. Something about what he actually valued when no one was watching how he valued it. He turned from the window then. He looked at her directly, the way he had looked at her in the study on the first day and had been looking at her, in careful increments, ever since. And he told her about his mother. He did not tell the story easily. She could see that, could see the slight recalibration that happened in his face as he began, the way a man looks when he is accessing something he does not take out often and is not entirely certain he should be taking out now. But he told it. He told her that his mother had been a woman of extraordinary intelligence and warmth and capability, the kind of woman who entered a room and made it feel inhabited, who managed the complexity of a great estate and the complexity of the people within it with a grace that made both look effortless, though he understood, watching her from childhood, that nothing about it was effortless at all. He told her that his mother had been married to his father, who was not a cruel man. He was careful to say that, not cruel. Simply a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that he understood his wife completely, and had stopped paying attention at precisely the moment that certainty took hold. He stopped seeing her. Not dramatically, not with violence, but in the slow and ordinary way that people stop seeing things they believe they already know, the way you stop seeing the painting on the wall you pass every morning, the way you stop hearing the clock that has been ticking in the hall for 20 years. His mother had spent the second half of her life making herself smaller to fit inside rooms that had stopped being designed for her. And she had done it without complaint, which he had understood too late was not contentment. It was love. And also, beneath the love, something that looked like resignation and broke his heart now when he thought about it. He said he had made a decision when she died. He had been 19. He had stood at her grave in the cold and made himself a promise, the kind of promise that 19-year-olds make at graves, that are sometimes forgotten and sometimes become the architecture of everything that follows. He had promised that he would never build that kind of room. That whatever he created, whoever came into his orbit, the space would be adequate. It would be honest. It would not require anyone to become less than they were in order to exist inside it. He stopped. He looked back at the rain. He had said more than he intended to say, and they both knew it, and the knowledge of it sat between them like something fragile, the way a candle flame sits between two people who are both careful not to move too quickly. Elara did not say anything immediately. She gave his words the same respect he had given hers, let them settle, let them mean what they meant, did not hurry past them to safer ground. When she spoke, she said only that it was a beautiful reason. And then, after a pause, that she had thought it was a practical one. He looked at her then with an expression that was entirely new. Not the measuring look from the study. Not the controlled interest of a man gathering information. This was something more exposed than that, something that had gotten past the composure rather than existing within it, the way water eventually gets past even the best laid stonework, not by force but by persistence and time. He almost said something. She saw it happen in his face, the gathering of words, the decision, and then he let it pass, and they both returned to watching the rain. But they stood closer than they had been before. She wasn't certain exactly when that had happened. Neither, she suspected, was he. It was the rain that did it, in the end. The rain and the dark and the particular intimacy of standing beside someone at a window in bad weather, where the world outside has become inhospitable and the space between two people indoors becomes, without anyone deciding it should, a kind of shelter. She had been thinking about what he said, about his mother, about the rooms he had promised not to build, and without planning it, without running it through the careful filter she ran most things through before allowing them out, she said his name. Just that. His name. Caspian. 2 syllables, spoken quietly into the rain-loud corridor, and the moment it was out she understood what she had done, had crossed a line that was technically invisible and practically enormous, the line between Miss Voss and the Duke of Ashenfall and 2 people standing at a window in the rain who had, over the course of a conversation neither of them had planned, said true things to each other. She caught herself. She started to correct it, started to shape the formal title back into her mouth, began the apology, and he stopped her. He said, "No. Don't apologize." She closed her mouth. The rain came down. Somewhere in the house a door shut in a draft. He said she could call him by his name. In private. He said it carefully, the way he said things that mattered, without decoration, without making it larger than it was, but without making it smaller either. In private. 2 words that built something without announcing they were building it. 2 words that meant, here, in this corridor, in this light, with the rain between us and the rest of the world, this is permitted. This is real. She said his name again. Deliberately this time. Not accidentally, not as a slip, but as a choice, small and quiet and entirely conscious, the way all the most important choices are. Caspian. She let it sit in the air between them for a moment. He said, yes. Just that. Yes. As though she had asked a question and he was answering it. As though saying his own name back to him was the thing he had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting for it, the thing that confirmed some calculation he had been running for weeks, that finally resolved, quietly and completely, into a single syllable of assent. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke again for a long time. The rain was still coming down hard against the windows and the last of the light had gone entirely now and the corridor was dim and warm and filled with the particular quality of quiet that only exists between 2 people who have just said something they cannot take back and are not certain they would want to. Supper was called shortly after. They went separately, he to the dining room, she to the staff hall, and the distance between those 2 tables, which had always been simply the distance between an employer and his household, felt different now. Not smaller exactly. More visible. The way you become aware of a wall only once you have imagined what it would be like on the other side of it. Lisa noticed that Alara was quiet through supper. Lisa noticed most things, but she had the good sense not to remark on all of them, and so she simply refilled Alara's water and talked about the storm and described, at considerable and cheerful length, how Hetty had reacted to the discovery that the kitchen roof was leaking directly over the bread station, and how the string of words she had deployed in response had been impressive enough in their creativity that even Fenwick had looked up from his ledger. Alara smiled in the right places. She ate. She was present enough. But a portion of her, a quiet, interior portion that she had not opened in a very long time, was still in the east corridor, still standing at that rain-covered window, still holding the weight of a conversation that had not been what either of them expected it to be and had somehow, because of that, been exactly what it needed to be. She was not a woman who fell easily into things. She had been careful her entire life, careful with her feelings, careful with her trust, careful with the small and precious reserves of herself that years of being dismissed had taught her to husband closely. She had learned not to reach for things that were likely to be moved before her hand arrived. She had learned to want quietly and let go quickly and never, if she could help it, to need. She was beginning to suspect that Ashenfall was going to make that very difficult. In the dining room on the other side of the house, Caspian ate alone as he always did, with a book open beside his plate. But tonight the book was closed before the first course was finished, and it stayed closed, and Fenwick, who brought the second course himself, on the pretext of a question about tomorrow's schedule that could easily have waited until morning, observed this without comment and filed it with everything else he had been quietly filing for the past several weeks. The rain continued through the night. It drummed against the roof of the east room where Alara lay awake in the good bed with the cedar-smelling linen, looking at the ceiling, listening. In Ashenfall the rain sounded different than it had in the Voss house. In the Voss house it had sounded like the roof was losing an argument. Here it sounded like an agreement, like the water and the stone had made their peace long ago and were simply living it out, comfortable in the established terms of their arrangement. She thought about what he had said. About his mother. About the rooms he refused to build. She turned it over and over the way she turned all things that mattered, looking at every face of it, testing its edges, trying to determine whether it was true, not whether he believed it, she had no doubt that he believed it, but whether it was the kind of truth that held up under the weight of real life or the kind that sounded right in corridors during rainstorms and dissolved in daylight. She thought about the way he had said her name back to her. Yes. One word. The absolute simplicity of it. She closed her eyes. The rain went on. And somewhere in the long, dark, rain-loud hours of the night, without making a decision and without meaning to and without any of the careful, protective deliberateness that had governed her heart for as long as she could remember, Alara Voss began, quietly and irreversibly, to hope. Chapter 5. The days after the Voss family's visit had a different quality to them. Not louder, Ashenfall was never loud, but fuller, somehow. As though the entrance hall confrontation had cleared something out of the air that had been accumulating without anyone noticing, and the house had drawn a breath into the space it left. The corridors felt lighter. The morning light seemed to arrive with more confidence. Even Hetty, who commented on the emotional atmosphere of the household approximately never, was seen to hum something while she worked on the Tuesday after, a thing she had reportedly not done in the 3 winters prior. Elara noticed all of it. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, steadily, without making a production of it, adding it to the running account she kept of the world around her. What she also noticed, and filed more carefully, was the change in the space between herself and Caspian. It had not become smaller exactly. But it had become different. More honest. Less padded with the careful performances of 2 people managing a situation and more simply 2 people in the same house, existing in proximity, no longer pretending that the proximity was incidental. He sought her out more now. Not obviously, he was not a man who did things obviously, would likely never be, and she had stopped expecting him to be and had found, somewhere in that surrender of expectation, a genuine appreciation for the way he actually was. He sought her out in the particular way of careful people, by being where she was, by angling his movements through the day so that they intersected with hers, by arriving in the library when she was there and staying longer than the errand that brought him required. By asking her opinion on things he did not strictly need her opinion on, in the way that people ask questions not because they lack the answer but because they want the conversation that comes with it. She asked him once, directly, in the way she did most things, because she had tried indirectness her whole life and found it exhausting and ineffective, whether he was aware that he was doing it. Seeking her out. She asked it without accusation and without coyness, the way she asked everything, because she genuinely wanted the answer and saw no reason to approach it any other way. He looked at her for a moment that was slightly longer than a simple yes or no required. Then he said yes. He said it with the complete composure of a man who had made his peace with the admission before he made it, who had arrived at honesty on this particular subject through the same deliberate process he arrived at all conclusions, through consideration, through patience, through the systematic elimination of all the alternatives until only the true thing remained. Yes. He was aware. He did not apologize for it. She said, "Good." And that was all either of them said about it for another 10 days, which was in its own way a complete conversation. It was Fenwick who knew first, which was appropriate, since Fenwick knew most things first, and had simply learned over the years to carry his knowledge with the discretion of a man who understands that the most valuable information is the kind that is shared only when the moment calls for it. He had watched the change in the Duke with the attentiveness of someone who has spent 6 years learning the precise shape of one person's ordinary so that any variation from it registers immediately. The variations were not subtle once you knew where to look. The route past the south wing, taken every evening now without fail and without acknowledgement. The correspondence that sat unopened a few minutes longer in the mornings, not neglected, never neglected, but held in hands that were momentarily elsewhere. The meals finished without the book being opened at all. The question, asked once with calculated casualness and never repeated but clearly not forgotten, of whether Elara had mentioned anything about her preferences regarding the East Gardens, whether she found them beautiful or whether she thought they could be improved. It was this last question that told Fenwick everything he needed to know. Because Caspian Ashford did not ask for opinions on the gardens. He had never asked for opinions on the gardens. He had an estate manager for the gardens, and a head groundskeeper, and a committee of his own exacting standards that had governed the grounds of Ashenfall for 6 years without consulting anyone outside the estate. The gardens were not a subject on which he sought input. Unless the input was from someone whose relationship to the gardens he was, on some level, already imagining as permanent. Fenwick said nothing to anyone. He simply began, with the quiet thoroughness of a man arranging things that need to be arranged, to ensure that a particular stretch of the Rose Garden, the oldest section, the one planted by the first Duchess of Ashenfall 200 years ago, where the roses were deep red and absurdly fragrant and climbed the old stone wall with the comfortable ease of things that have been in one place long enough to claim it, was at its best. Freshly tended. Clear of the winter's dead growth. The bench beside the wall cleaned and steady. Small things. The kind of things that would not be noticed unless someone was looking for them. The kind of things that matter enormously when everything is finally said. On a morning in early summer, 3 months, almost exactly, after a carriage with 2 dark horses had passed through the silent gates of Ashenfall carrying a woman in a worn grey dress with a small leather bag and a mother's blue shawl, Elara woke before the light arrived and lay in her east-facing room and listened to the house. She had developed, in these 3 months, a relationship with the sounds of Ashenfall that was its own form of intimacy. She knew the house in darkness and in light, in rain and in the dry clarity of summer mornings, in the small hours when only the structure itself was awake and speaking in its private language of timber and stone. She knew which part of the roof caught the wind from the north. She knew the particular rhythm of the clock in the downstairs hall and how it differed from the clock in the study, same make, different age, the older one running half a beat slow as though it had decided decades ago that time was not something to be hurried. She knew the sound the oak trees made when the morning came across them, a sound like quiet breathing, like something enormous and patient continuing to be. She had not expected, 3 months ago, to know any of this. She had not expected to still be here in the sense that matters, not contractually, not in the letter of the arrangement, but fully, in herself, with her whole attention and her whole presence and the parts of herself she had kept folded away for safekeeping for so many years that she had almost forgotten what they looked like opened out. She had not expected a house to feel like this. She had not expected to understand, from the inside, the difference between a place you inhabit because you have no other option and a place you inhabit because something in you recognizes it. Because it fits. Because the rooms were made, somehow, in the shape of the person you actually are rather than the person you were told to be. She got up. She dressed. She went down to the kitchen where Hetty was already at work, and she helped with the bread in the way she always did now, without asking, without requiring instruction, in the easy collaborative silence of 2 people who have established a rhythm together and no longer need to narrate it. Hetty set a cup of tea in front of her without being asked. Elara drank it. Outside the kitchen window the summer morning was building itself slowly and beautifully, the sky moving from charcoal to silver to the pale, luminous blue of a day that intended to be generous. Lisa appeared at the kitchen door with bright eyes and absolutely no capacity for concealment and said that Fenwick had asked whether Elara had any fixed tasks in the East Gardens this morning, or whether her schedule might allow for some flexibility around mid-morning. She delivered this message with the elaborate casualness of someone who has been very specifically told to deliver it casually and is not built for casual delivery. Elara looked at her over her tea. Lisa looked back with an expression of heroic innocence. Elara set down her cup. She told Lisa to tell Fenwick that her schedule was flexible. Lisa's heroic innocence cracked into something incandescent and she left before she was required to say anything else. The rose garden in early summer was almost unreasonably beautiful. That was the word that came to her, unreasonable, because this degree of beauty seemed to exceed what was strictly necessary, to go beyond the functional and into something that could only be called extravagance, except that it was entirely natural, which made it the most honest extravagance there was. The roses on the old stone wall were fully open, deep red, heavy with themselves, and the air around them was so fragrant that it had a texture, warm and sweet and so thick with life that breathing it felt like eating something. The bench was clean and steady in the morning light. The grass between the paths was dark with dew. She walked through the garden slowly, taking her time, touching nothing, just moving through it the way you move through something you want to memorize, the way you move through a piece of music you know you will want to return to. She rounded the corner into the oldest section and she saw him. He was standing beside the bench. Not pacing, Caspian Ashford did not pace, had likely not paced in his adult life, the habit of controlled stillness was too deeply installed for that. But he had the look of a man who had arrived early and had spent the time since arrival in an interior argument of some intensity. He was very precisely composed. His hands were at his sides. His spine was straight. His expression was the expression he wore when he was working very hard to appear as though he was not working at all. She had spent 3 months learning his face. She saw all of it immediately. She slowed her pace as she approached, not to be coy but to give him a moment, and also, if she was being honest with herself, to give herself one. Because her heart, that careful and thoroughly defended organ that had learned over 20 years to want quietly and let go quickly and never, if it could help it, to need, was doing something it had not done in a very long time. It was undefended. Completely, simply, without strategy or protection, open. And that was a condition she had not been in since she was young enough that her mother was still alive to make it safe. It was, she found, both terrifying and the most natural thing she had felt in years, and the coexistence of those two sensations was so perfectly characteristic of Ashenfall, of everything that Ashenfall had turned out to be, that she almost laughed. She stopped a few feet away. He looked at her. The morning was very quiet. Somewhere in the roses a bird was doing something uncomplicated and cheerful, entirely indifferent to the weight of the human moment happening below it. He said her name. Just her name. Ilara. In the way he had been saying it since the corridor and the rain, without title, without distance, with the quiet directness of a man who has stopped performing and started simply speaking. She answered with his. They stood in the oldest part of the rose garden in the early light of a summer morning and looked at each other, and the look contained everything that had accumulated between them in 3 months of working books and silent gates and an almost smile and a rainy window and a hand extended in an empty hall. It contained all of it. It was a very full look. He reached into his coat pocket and he took out a ring. It was not a large ring. She noticed that immediately, and it told her something about the difference between this man and the kind of man who might have been expected to occupy this house and this title. A large ring would have been about the house, about the title, about the communication of a certain magnitude of wealth and intention. This ring was not about any of those things. It was a dark stone, the blue-black of a winter sky just before the last of the light leaves it entirely, set simply in a band of dark gold, with no excess, no ornamentation beyond what the stone itself required. It was beautiful in the way that precise, considered things are beautiful. It was beautiful the way Ashenfall was beautiful. It had not been chosen to impress. It had been chosen to be right. He held it and he looked at her and he said what he had come to say. He said, "You came here as part of a transaction I am not proud of." He did not soften that. He did not reach for language that would make it easier to sit with, because he had decided. She could hear the decision in the way he spoke, the careful deliberateness of a man who had prepared this and then set the preparation aside and was now simply speaking, that she deserved the unpadded version. The true version. She had always deserved the true version, and he was going to give it to her even where it did not reflect well on him. He said, "You had been told your whole life that you were useless. That you were worthless. That you were too much and not enough in all the ways that the people around you found most convenient. And you walked into my study on the first day and you told me, very quietly and very directly, that you were none of those things." He paused. He said, "I could not look away after that. I want you to know that I tried. I tried because it seemed important, at the beginning, to maintain a clear boundary between what this arrangement was and what it was becoming, and I could not do it. I could not look away from you, Ilara. I have not been able to look away from you since the first day, and I have stopped wanting to." She was very still. The garden was very still. Even the bird in the roses had gone quiet, as though the morning itself had decided to listen. He said, "I want to make an entirely different kind of arrangement. One I am asking you to enter freely, with full knowledge of what it means, full freedom to refuse it, and the absolute certainty that if you refuse it, nothing in this house changes, nothing I think of you changes, and you remain here for as long as you choose on exactly the terms that currently exist." He said, "I am asking you, not requiring you. Those are different things and I need you to know that I know they are different things." He held up the ring and he said, "Be my Duchess." Not a position. Not a title. Not the next chapter of a transaction. Be my partner. My equal in this house and in this estate and in everything I am and everything I intend to build. I am not a simple man to know, I am aware of that, I have been told, and I believe it is largely accurate, but I am an honest one, and I will spend every day that you allow me in this role working to deserve it. I am asking you, Ilara Voss. I am asking you. He stopped. He had said it. All of it, or enough of it, the rest would be a lifetime of saying, and he was, she understood in this moment, entirely prepared for that. He stood in the oldest part of the rose garden in the morning light, holding a ring that he had chosen because it was right rather than impressive, and he waited. He was very good at waiting. He had spent 6 years learning patience in the way that only real loss teaches it. He was patient now. But his eyes, his controlled, measuring, give nothing away eyes, were doing something they almost never did. They were asking. Openly. Without defense. She looked at him for a long time. Not because she was uncertain, she understood, standing in that garden, that she had not been uncertain for some time, that the uncertainty she had been carrying was not about her feelings but about whether she was permitted to have them, which was an entirely different thing and one she was done letting the Voss house decide for her. She looked at him because she wanted to remember this. The exact quality of the morning light. The smell of the deep red roses. The bird in the wall that had started singing again, small and unhurried and entirely sure of itself. His face, unguarded, asking, the composed surface of him parted just enough to show what lived underneath, which was warmer and more uncertain and more genuinely hopeful than she had ever expected to see in a man who had spent 6 years building Ashenfall into something impenetrable. She thought about her mother. She did not do it deliberately, Vivian simply arrived, the way she always arrived, not as grief anymore but as presence, warm and close, the lavender smell and the full-body laugh and the voice that had told a 6-year-old girl to breathe in through the nose and out through the mouth and let the feeling move through you like weather. She thought her mother would have liked this garden. She thought her mother would have liked this man. She thought her mother, who had spent her own life in rooms that were not built to the right dimensions, would have looked at this moment, at the garden and the ring and the man standing in it asking rather than requiring, and she would have laughed. The full-body laugh. And then she would have told her daughter, well. What are you waiting for? She took the ring from his hand. She held it in her palm for a moment and looked at it, the winter sky stone, the dark gold band, the thing chosen to be right rather than large, and she felt the full weight of what it meant. Not the weight of obligation. Not the weight of transaction or debt or exchange or any of the languages that had governed the last 20 years of her life. The weight of a choice. Her choice, made freely, with open eyes, on ground that was hers. She thought about the girl she had been in the Voss house. The girl who had mended hems at midnight for dresses that would never be worn in her honor, who had pressed linen and hauled water and kept roses alive that no one had planted for her, who had carried the word useless and the word worthless for so long that she had worn grooves in herself in their shape. She thought about that girl standing 3 steps behind her father beneath a fig tree in the bruising evening light, looking lost. Looking like a woman at the edge of a story she had not been asked to enter. And she thought, look where the story went. She placed the ring on her own finger. It fit. Of course it fit. She had the brief, luminous suspicion that he had found out her size, had asked someone, or measured something of hers when she wasn't looking, had done the quiet, thorough, entirely characteristic work of getting it right before it mattered, and the suspicion was so completely him that it undid her in the best possible way. She looked up at him. He was watching her with the expression he almost never let anyone see, the one beneath the composure, beneath the title and the stillness and the 6 years of carrying everything alone. The expression of a man who has not let himself want something for a very long time and is now standing in a garden holding the evidence that he has it, and does not quite know yet what to do with the feeling. She told him yes.